Margaret paused at the entrance of the Grand Hotel, her gaze drawn upwards to the towering structure that loomed before her. The glass doors slid open with a quiet hum, revealing a lobby bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The marble floors beneath her feet gleamed, reflecting the opulence that surrounded her. For a moment she hesitated, her weathered hand gripping the worn strap of her canvas bag a little tighter. She was out of place here, and she knew it. Her grey hair, wild and untamed, framed a face etched with the lines of time. Her clothes, though clean, were faded and frayed at the edges, a testament to years of use. The hem of her coat was slightly torn, and her shoes, scuffed and old, were a far cry from the polished loafers and high heels that clicked across the polished floor. As Margaret stepped inside, the warmth of the hotel enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chill that had seeped into her bones from the outside. But it wasn't just the physical warmth she noticed. It was the sudden change in atmosphere. The quiet conversations that had filled the air moments before seemed to falter, and she could feel the eyes of the hotel staff on her. She glanced around, taking in the lavish surroundings, with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The guests moved with an effortless grace, their designer clothes whispering of wealth and privilege. She caught a glimpse of herself in one of the large mirrors that lined the walls and saw the stark contrast between herself and those around her. Her reflection was a jarring reminder that she didn't belong in a place like this. Margaret stood firm at the front desk, her gaze steady as she met Ethan's eyes. The opulence of the hotel surrounded her, a stark reminder of the world she had left behind long ago. Her clothes, worn, frayed at the edges and out of place, might have whispered of poverty, but her posture was anything but defeated. "I'd like to book a room," Margaret repeated, her voice soft but resolute, the determination in her tone unmistakable. Ethan hesitated, his polite smile wavering as he processed her request. He glanced over her again, his eyes lingering on the worn sandals peeking out from beneath her skirt. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the screen in front of him, though Margaret knew he was no longer checking for availability. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight, ma'am," Ethan finally said, the words coming out slower, more deliberate, as if he hoped they would carry more weight that way. His gaze flickered to the key slots behind him, the empty spaces betraying his lie. Margaret didn't miss it. She studied him for a moment, her expression calm but unyielding. "It's a busy time of year," she remarked, her eyes momentarily drifting to the luxurious surroundings, the chandeliers glittering overhead. "I understand." There was a pause. Ethan could feel the tension tightening around them, the air thick with the unspoken truth. He glanced again at the empty key slots, then back at Margaret, but he said nothing. Margaret leaned in slightly, her voice lowering just enough to convey her seriousness. "I'm certain there's a room available. I'm not asking for much, just a place to rest." Ethan's polite mask began to crack, his discomfort now visible in the tight line of his mouth. He glanced to the side, as if seeking some escape from the situation, but found none. The staff members nearby had started to take notice, their curiosity palpable as they subtly watched the exchange. Margaret could feel their eyes on her, each glance a silent judgment. Ethan cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "As I said, ma'am, we're fully booked. Perhaps another hotel in the area could accommodate you." The condescension in his voice was impossible to miss, and Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She stood a little straighter, her shoulders squared, refusing to let him dismiss her so easily. "I'm here," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the shallow politeness that coated Ethan's words. "I'll take any room you have available." Ethan's discomfort turned to irritation, his patience clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, as I've mentioned, You're not fully booked, Margaret interrupted, her voice steady and unwavering. The sudden firmness in her tone startled Ethan, and for a brief moment he was at a loss for words. The nearby staff exchanged glances, the tension in the air becoming more pronounced. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting to be heard. "I'm not leaving," she stated plainly, her eyes locking onto his. "If you don't have a room available, I'll wait until you do." Ethan stared at her, caught off guard by the unexpected resolve in her words. He glanced around, hoping to find support from his colleagues, but they remained silent, their eyes avoiding his. The situation had become more than he'd anticipated, and he was unsure of how to proceed. Margaret held his gaze, her expression unwavering. The awe she had felt moments before, when she first entered the hotel, had been replaced by something stronger, something that refused to be dismissed or ignored. She was not here to be pitied, nor to be condescended to. She was here because she had as much right to be as anyone else. Ethan's face hardened, and he drew in a slow breath, his response now cold and final. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's nothing I can do for you." Margaret took in his words, the definitive rejection hanging in the air between them. Margaret stood her ground, her back straightening slightly despite the weight of the years that had bent it over time. She met Ethan's eyes once more, her voice calm but resolute. "I'd like to speak with your manager, please." Ethan hesitated, the uncertainty flickering across his face again. He wasn't used to such persistence, especially from someone who looked so out of place in a setting like this. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the ambient noise of the lobby. "I'm the manager on duty. What seems to be the problem here?" Nina, the front desk supervisor, approached with the air of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. Her posture was rigid, her movements precise, as she came to stand beside Ethan. She was sharply dressed, her dark hair pulled back into a severe bun, and her eyes were cold as they appraised Margaret. "There's no problem, ma'am," Ethan began, but Nina waved him off, her gaze never leaving Margaret. "Is there something I can help you with?" Nina's tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a clear message that she was not here to entertain complaints. Margaret looked at her, unflinching. "I've asked for a room, and I've been told there are none available," she said, her voice steady, though it took effort to keep it so. "But I can see there are rooms still open." Nina's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. "I'm afraid that information is not correct," she replied curtly. "As I'm sure Ethan has already explained, we are fully booked for the evening." Margaret didn't respond immediately, her eyes searching Nina's for any sign of understanding, of empathy. There was none. Instead, she found only a wall of indifference, a clear signal that she was not welcome here. She could feel the tension building in the air, thick and suffocating. "I'm not leaving until I've spoken to someone in charge," Margaret said, her voice growing firmer. There was a dignity in her stance, a quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges far greater than this. Nina's lips pressed into a thin line. "I am in charge," she said, her tone growing sharper, "and I'm telling you, we cannot accommodate you. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Margaret shook her head slightly, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "I have the right to be here, just as much as anyone else." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment there was silence. Then, with a frustrated sigh, Nina signaled to the security guard stationed near the entrance. The guard, a large man with a stern expression, approached quickly, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Nina didn't wait for the guard to reach them before continuing. "If you refuse to leave, we'll have no choice but to escort you out," she said, her voice cold and final. "This establishment has standards, and we must maintain them." The guard reached Margaret's side, his presence looming large over her small frame. He placed a hand on her arm, not roughly but with enough force to make it clear that there was no room for negotiation. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with me," he said, his voice low but firm. Margaret didn't resist. Her eyes remained locked on Nina's, searching for some flicker of humanity, some sign that this woman might reconsider. But Nina's expression remained impassive, her decision made. As the guard began to lead her away, Margaret allowed herself one last look around the lobby. The heavy service door swung shut with a muted thud behind Margaret, the cold night air nipping at her skin. She stood there, momentarily disoriented by the sudden change in atmosphere, her breath visible in the chill. The alley behind the hotel was dimly lit, the harsh fluorescence from inside casting long, eerie shadows. "Ma'am, this way," the security guard said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He gestured toward the side exit that led to the street. Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable, and began to shuffle forward, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. Before they could reach the door, a voice rang out from the shadows, firm but not harsh. "Hold on a minute." Both Margaret and the guard turned to see a woman stepping into the light. She was of average height, with warm brown eyes and a demeanor that exuded both authority and kindness. Her uniform marked her as part of the hotel staff, but the badge on her chest identified her as Emily, the head of housekeeping. "Is there a problem here?" Emily asked, her gaze shifting from the guard to Margaret and back again. The guard hesitated, his grip on Margaret's arm loosening slightly. "No problem, ma'am. Just escorting this guest off the premises as instructed." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her tone even. "And why exactly is she being escorted out the back, like some kind of criminal?" The guard looked uncomfortable. "Orders from the front desk. She was causing a disturbance in the lobby." Emily turned her attention fully to Margaret, taking in her frail appearance, the worn clothes, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself despite the clear humiliation she had just endured. There was a flicker of recognition in Emily's eyes, a silent understanding that passed between the two women. "That'll be all. Thank you," Emily said to the guard, her tone leaving no room for argument. Relieved, the guard nodded and stepped back, leaving the two women alone in the quiet service area. Emily approached Margaret slowly, her expression softening. "Are you all right, ma'am?" she asked gently. Margaret looked up at her, her eyes tired but still sharp. She managed a small nod, though it was clear that the evening's events had taken a toll on her. "Come, sit down for a moment," Emily urged, guiding Margaret to a nearby bench against the wall. The wood was worn, but it provided a place to rest, and Margaret sank down gratefully. Emily disappeared for a moment, returning with a bottle of water. She handed it to Margaret, her eyes full of concern. "Here, drink this." Margaret accepted the bottle, her hands trembling slightly as she unscrewed the cap. She took a small sip, the cold water soothing her parched throat. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," Emily said after a moment, her voice low. "It's not right, the way they treated you." Margaret shook her head, her voice soft as she replied, "You don't need to apologize for them. It's not your fault." Emily sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort but leaving enough space to respect Margaret's need for personal space. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city filtering in from the street, a distant hum that felt far removed from the quiet of the service area. "Do you have anywhere to go tonight?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were still wrapped around the bottle. "No," she admitted quietly. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "If you'd like, you could come with me. My place isn't much, but it's warm and safe. I'd hate to think of you out on the streets tonight." Margaret looked at Emily, surprise flickering in her eyes. There was a sincerity in Emily's offer, a genuine kindness that Margaret hadn't expected to find after the night she'd had. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked, her voice tinged with both gratitude and hesitation. Emily smiled, a warm, reassuring expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Absolutely. It's no trouble at all." Margaret felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest, but she pushed it down, nodding slowly instead. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily stood, extending a hand to help Margaret to her feet. "Come on, then. Let's get you out of the cold." As they left the service area, the door swinging shut behind them, Margaret felt the sting of the evening begin to ease. She didn't know what awaited her at Emily's home, but for the first time in what felt like hours, she didn't feel so alone. Emily's presence beside her was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that kindness could still be found in unexpected places. And as they walked out into the night, Margaret allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be all right. The cab ride to Emily's home was a quiet one. Margaret sat in the back seat, her hands resting on her lap, the city lights flickering through the window as they drove through Hartford's winding streets. Emily sat beside her, glancing over every so often, her expression calm and reassuring. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but rather a shared space, each woman lost in her own thoughts. When they finally arrived, Emily led Margaret up a short flight of steps to a modest brick building. The apartment complex was old, but well-maintained, with neatly trimmed bushes lining the walkway and a small porch light that flickered warmly in the night. Emily unlocked the door, and they stepped inside, leaving the chill of the evening behind. Margaret paused just inside the doorway, taking in her surroundings. The apartment was small, but there was a warmth to it that the Grand Hotel could never offer. The living room was cozy, with a worn but comfortable-looking sofa, a couple of armchairs, and a coffee table cluttered with books and magazines. The walls were adorned with family photos, moments frozen in time. Emily and James on their wedding day, laughing with friends at a picnic, holding a baby that must have been a niece or nephew. The smell of something savory wafted from the kitchen, and Margaret's stomach tightened with a hunger she hadn't acknowledged until now. "Welcome," Emily said softly, closing the door behind them. She motioned for Margaret to sit on the sofa. "Make yourself at home." Margaret lowered herself onto the sofa, the cushions sagging slightly under her weight. She couldn't remember the last time she had been in a home like this, so full of life, so lived in. She felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, something between nostalgia and longing. Emily disappeared into the kitchen, and Margaret could hear the sounds of her moving about, the clinking of dishes, the soft hum of a kettle coming to a boil. It was a soothing soundtrack, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of the hotel. A few minutes later, Emily returned with a tray. On it were 3 bowls of steaming soup, a loaf of crusty bread, and a small dish of butter. Behind her, a man in a wheelchair rolled into the room, a welcoming smile on his face. "Margaret, this is my husband, James," Emily said, placing the tray on the coffee table. "James, this is Margaret. She'll be staying with us tonight." James extended his hand, and Margaret took it, his grip firm and warm. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Margaret," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Thank you for having me," Margaret replied, her voice softer now, almost uncertain. She had been through so much in the past few hours that the kindness of these two strangers felt almost overwhelming. "Please, let's eat before the soup gets cold," Emily said, breaking the moment with a smile. She handed Margaret a bowl, the rich aroma of the soup filling the room, and then passed one to James. They ate in companionable silence at first, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional creak of the sofa as someone shifted. The soup was hearty and filling, warming Margaret from the inside out. She hadn't realized how much she needed this, a simple meal shared with others. As they finished, James leaned back in his chair, looking over at Margaret. "Emily mentioned you had a rough evening," he said gently. "Do you want to talk about it?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to her empty bowl. She wasn't used to sharing her troubles, least of all with people she had just met. But there was something about the way James asked, something in his eyes that told her he genuinely wanted to listen. "It's a long story," she began, her voice quiet. "I was just trying to find a place to stay for the night, but things didn't go as planned." Emily and James exchanged a glance, but they didn't press her for more. Instead, Emily reached out and touched Margaret's hand, her fingers warm against Margaret's cold skin. "You're safe here," she said simply. Margaret looked up, meeting Emily's gaze. For a moment, the walls she had built around herself felt less necessary, and she allowed herself to relax, if only a little. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The evening wore on, and the conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics. James told stories of his days before the accident, of the places he and Emily had traveled, of the challenges they had faced together. Margaret listened, drawn in by the quiet resilience in their words. They didn't dwell on their hardships, but it was clear they had been through more than their fair share. And as she listened, Margaret found herself sharing bits of her own life, small pieces at first, but then more as the night went on. She talked about the things she had seen, the people she had known, the losses she had endured. And with each word, she felt the weight on her shoulders lighten, just a little. As Emily led Margaret to the bedroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that she was exactly where she needed to be. Margaret awoke before dawn, the soft light of the morning filtering through the curtains of the small guest room. She lay still for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of the city waking up outside the window. Her mind was clear, the events of the previous day now neatly compartmentalized, but not forgotten. There was something she needed to do, and she felt more resolved than ever. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb the peaceful silence of Emily and James's home. After dressing in the same clothes she had worn the day before, she made her way to the kitchen where she found Emily already up, nursing a cup of coffee. Emily looked up as Margaret entered, a soft smile on her lips. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm with the comfort of familiarity. "Sleep well?" Margaret returned the smile, though hers was tinged with the weight of what was to come. "Better than I have in a long time," she replied, taking a seat at the small kitchen table. Emily studied her for a moment, sensing the change in her demeanor. "You're heading back there, aren't you?" she asked gently. Margaret nodded. "I need to. There are things that need to be set right." Emily's expression tightened with concern, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over Margaret's. "I'll come with you." Margaret squeezed her hand, grateful for the offer. "Thank you, Emily," she said softly, "but I need to do this on my own." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but if you need anything, you call me, okay?" Margaret promised she would, and after a few more moments of quiet conversation, she stood to leave. They exchanged a final brief hug, and Margaret stepped out into the early morning chill, her heart steady with determination. Several hours later, the streets of Hartford were bustling with life. Emily was at work, immersed in the routines of her day, when the quiet of the lobby was interrupted by the low purr of a luxury car pulling up to the entrance. The doorman, accustomed to high-end clientele, straightened his posture as a gleaming Rolls-Royce glided to a stop. The car's door swung open, and out stepped a woman of undeniable presence, Margaret. But this was not the Margaret who had been ushered out the service entrance the night before. This was Margaret as she truly was. A woman of power, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, her silver hair styled with care. She exuded an air of authority that seemed to make the very air around her crackle with anticipation. The doorman, momentarily taken aback, quickly recovered and stepped forward to open the doors. Margaret moved through the entrance with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed. But now, there was no mistaking her purpose. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached the front desk, where Ethan stood once again, this time his expression one of barely concealed shock. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice cool and composed. "I'd like to speak with the manager." Ethan, his face drained of color, fumbled for words. "Yes, of course, I'll get him right away," he stammered, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by a nervous deference. As he hurried away, Margaret turned to the young woman behind the counter. "And please, ask Emily to join us as well." The receptionist nodded quickly, casting a wide-eyed glance at her colleagues, who were already whispering among themselves. Margaret could feel the ripple of unease spreading through the staff, but she remained calm, her expression unreadable. It wasn't long before David, the hotel manager, arrived, his stride confident until he saw who was waiting for him. He paused, disbelief flickering across his face as he took in Margaret's transformation. "Ma'am, he began, but Margaret held up a hand, silencing him with a gesture. "Before you say anything," Margaret said evenly, "I think it's time we addressed what happened yesterday." David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emily arrived at that moment, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern as she took in the scene. "Emily," Margaret said, her tone softening as she acknowledged the woman who had shown her kindness when no one else would. "Thank you for coming." Emily nodded, moving to stand beside Margaret, a silent show of support. Margaret turned her attention back to David, who still stood speechless, trying to process what was unfolding before him. "David," Margaret continued, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of authority, "I am Margaret Wallace, the owner of this hotel and the entire chain. Yesterday, I came here seeking nothing more than a place to rest, and I was met with disdain and dismissal." David's face flushed with panic, his composure rapidly unraveling. "Mrs. Wallace, I had no idea." "That much is clear," Margaret interrupted, though her tone remained calm. "Now, everyone go into the meeting room." Margaret stood in the center of the hotel's conference room, the air thick with tension. The staff had gathered in response to her directive, their faces a mix of apprehension and guilt. The once bustling, confident employees were now silent, their earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable unease. The room was filled with the murmured sounds of shifting feet and the occasional cough, each sound punctuating the heavy atmosphere. David, the hotel manager, stood off to the side, his expression one of careful neutrality, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. Nina and Ethan were among the crowd, their faces pale, eyes downcast. Margaret let the silence stretch, giving each of them time to fully absorb the gravity of the moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, carrying the weight of authority she had long held but seldom displayed so openly. "I'm sure by now you all know who I am," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "And I'm sure you all know why we're here." No one dared to respond, their eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding her gaze. Margaret allowed the silence to linger, letting her words sink in. "What happened here was unacceptable," she continued, her tone cool but controlled. "I came to this hotel seeking nothing more than the same respect and service you would offer any guest, but what I found was prejudice and disdain." Margaret's words were measured, but the disappointment in her voice was unmistakable. She paused, her gaze settling on Ethan, who flinched under the weight of her scrutiny. "I have always believed that a person's character is revealed not in how they treat their equals, but in how they treat those they perceive as beneath them," she said, her tone softening slightly. "And by that measure, many of you have failed." Ethan looked up, his eyes pleading, but he said nothing. Beside him, Nina's jaw tightened, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Margaret's eyes flickered to her, then back to the group as a whole. "Under normal circumstances," Margaret continued, her voice firm once more, "I would have no hesitation in terminating those who fail to uphold the values of this hotel. And believe me, I have considered it." A murmur rippled through the room, the fear palpable now. Margaret let the tension build for a moment before raising a hand to silence them. "But," she said, her tone shifting, "there is something to be said for second chances." Emily, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward at Margaret's gesture. Margaret turned to face her, a look of respect passing between them. "Emily has reminded me that we all make mistakes," Margaret said, her gaze returning to the staff, "and that sometimes the best way to learn is through those mistakes. She believes that each of you deserves an opportunity to make things right, and I trust her judgment." Emily's presence was a quiet force in the room, her expression calm but resolute. She met Margaret's eyes, offering a small nod of gratitude before turning to face her colleagues. "I've worked with many of you for years," Emily began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "I know what you're capable of, and I believe you can do better. We're not here just to do a job. We're here to serve people, to make them feel welcome, no matter who they are or where they come from." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. The staff shifted, glancing at one another, the realization of their own shortcomings settling in. Margaret let the silence linger before she spoke again. "I'm giving you all a chance to redeem yourselves," she said, her tone softer now, but no less authoritative. "But this is not a free pass. Each of you will undergo extensive training, supervised by myself and Emily, to ensure that you understand what it means to serve with dignity and respect." She paused, her gaze locking onto Ethan and Nina. "And let me be clear, this is your last chance. I expect nothing less than complete commitment to the values we hold dear." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding slowly, while Nina's defiance seemed to waver, replaced by something akin to humility. The weight of Margaret's words hung in the air, their implications clear to everyone present. Margaret stepped back, signaling the end of her address. "We start today," she said, her voice firm, "and I will be here to see it through." The staff slowly began to disperse, the gravity of the situation evident in their subdued movements. As they filed out, Margaret remained where she was, watching them with a critical eye. She knew this wouldn't be easy, Change never was, but she was determined to see it through. As days turned into months since that last meeting, the hotel had changed in ways that Margaret could feel in the very air. There was a quiet hum of contentment that buzzed just beneath the surface, a sense that this place had become more than just a building of luxury. It was a sanctuary of respect and dignity. Margaret walked through the lobby with purpose, her steps measured. Today was about more than just the hotel. Today was about Emily and James, the two people who had opened their home to her without hesitation, who had shown her kindness when the world seemed intent on turning its back. She found them waiting in one of the hotel's private lounges, a space that was cozy and intimate, with soft lighting that cast a warm glow across the room. Emily looked up as Margaret entered, her face lighting with a smile that was both welcoming and curious. James sat beside her, his wheelchair positioned near a large window that overlooked the city. The morning sun filtered in, painting them both in a golden light. "Margaret," Emily greeted her, standing as she approached. "We weren't expecting you to visit us here." Margaret returned the smile, though hers was laced with a touch of something more serious. "There's something I want to share with you both," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "Please sit down." Emily glanced at James, who nodded subtly, and they both took their seats again, their attention fully on Margaret. Taking a deep breath, Margaret began. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me, how you welcomed me into your home when I had nowhere else to go. It's a kindness I can never truly repay, but I'd like to try." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "This hotel has been my life's work, but more than that, it's a place where I've always wanted people to feel valued and cared for. You've shown me that value goes beyond just words. It's in the actions we take, the way we treat others, and because of that, I want to give something back to you." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder, handing it to Emily. "Inside, you'll find the deed to a new house. It's closer to the hotel, so your commute will be easier. And it's been modified to include everything James needs for his mobility. It's a small gesture compared to what you've given me, but I hope it brings you some comfort." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. For a moment she was silent, the enormity of the gift rendering her speechless. When she finally looked up, her eyes were brimming with unshed tears. "Margaret, we can't possibly accept this." Margaret smiled gently, shaking her head. "You can and you will. It's the least I can do for everything you've done." James placed a hand on Emily's arm, his voice quiet but firm. "It's an incredible gift, Margaret. Thank you." But Margaret wasn't finished. She turned back to Emily, her gaze softening even more. "There's one more thing. I've seen the way you manage your work, the care and dedication you bring to everything you do. I want to help you take that further. I'll be sponsoring your education in hospitality management, with the promise of a promotion to a regional manager role within the hotel chain once you've completed your studies." This time, Emily couldn't hold back the tears. They slipped down her cheeks silently, her breath hitching as she tried to speak. But words failed her, and instead she reached out, pulling Margaret into a tight embrace. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, more than words ever could. Margaret returned the hug, her heart full. "You deserve this, Emily. Both of you do, and I can't wait to see what you'll achieve." When they finally pulled apart, there was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had been strengthened not by grand acts, but by the simple, powerful exchange of kindness and respect. Months had passed since the day Margaret had offered her gifts to Emily and James. The hotel had continued to transform, but, more importantly, so had the lives of those connected to it. Emily's ascent to her new role was nothing short of remarkable. She approached her responsibilities with the same quiet determination that had guided her through life, but now there was a confidence that had blossomed from within. She managed multiple hotels across the region, her natural leadership shining through in every decision she made. The staff, who had once viewed her as just another colleague, now respected her as a leader who balanced authority with empathy. Margaret watched all of this with a sense of pride. It wasn't the pride of someone who had given a gift, but the pride of seeing someone realize their potential. Emily was thriving, and in doing so, she was lifting those around her, fostering an environment where everyone was encouraged to grow. James, too, had found his stride. The new car had opened up a world of possibilities for him. He could move freely without the constraints that had once limited his independence. With a renewed sense of purpose, he took on a role at a local non-profit, offering his skills to help others with mobility challenges. The work was fulfilling, giving him a sense of dignity that had been missing for too long. Their home, now filled with the warmth of stability and love, had become a place of frequent gatherings. Margaret was a regular visitor, her once solitary life now enriched by the friendship she shared with Emily and James. She would join them for dinners, the table always set with care, the conversation flowing easily. There was no longer a sense of duty in their interactions, only the simple, genuine pleasure of being together. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch of Emily and James's new home, the sun setting in a wash of colours across the sky, Margaret found herself lost in thought. The sound of laughter echoed from the kitchen where James was preparing tea, while Emily and Margaret relaxed on the porch swing, the gentle creak of the wood a comforting backdrop. "You've done so much, Margaret," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. "Not just for us, but for everyone at the hotel. You've changed things in a way that will last." Margaret looked at her, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I didn't do it alone, Emily. You and James and everyone who decided to see things differently. You're the ones who made it last. I just helped point the way." Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the evening. "Still, none of this would have happened without you. We're all better for having you in our lives." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her, not just from the words, but from the truth they held. The bond they had forged was unbreakable, built on a foundation of shared experiences and mutual respect. It wasn't about the gifts she had given or the changes she had initiated. It was about the connections they had made, the understanding that had grown between them. As the night settled in, James joined them on the porch, handing each of them a cup of tea. They sat together in comfortable silence, the night sounds of the neighborhood a gentle reminder of the life they had all chosen to build. Margaret knew that the lessons learned here would continue to shape their lives in ways they couldn't yet foresee. The kindness, the forgiveness, the respect. They were not just fleeting moments, but values that had been deeply ingrained in all of them. And as they sat there, under the blanket of stars, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace. The world was still full of challenges, still imperfect in so many ways, but here, in this small corner of it, there was hope. There was the promise of a future built on the foundation of the lessons they'd learned together. A future where compassion and justice weren't just ideals, but realities they lived every day. And that, Margaret realized, was more than enough. And that's the story, a beautiful reminder of the profound impact that a single act of kindness can have. Margaret's journey teaches us that kindness is not just a gesture, it's a force that can change lives, heal wounds, and transform hearts. In a world where we often rush past each other, let's take a moment to remember the power of compassion. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need a little kindness in their life today. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that can lift your spirits and inspire your day. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Remember, a small act of kindness can go a long way. Let's continue to spread that kindness, one story at a time. Take care, be kind, and I'll see you in the next video.